Hi there, and welcome to Let's Talk About Health. I'm Dr. Madeline Mant, and today we're going to be talking to Dr. Mindy Pitre, who has generously agreed to speak with us about her work as a paleoepidemiologist. So welcome, Mindy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Maddie.
All right, Mindy, what is your job? What is your position?
All right. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. So it's basically a place in the middle of nowhere, south of Ottawa, just kind of like right past the border. It's a really cool place. I'm also the J. Ansel Ramsey Professor in Public Health and the STEM and Social Sciences, and the co-coordinator of our public health program. So I kind of run the whole public health program and the minor here, and we have a lot of students. So like you just said, I'm a paleoepidemiologist, and that's kind of a mouthful. I actually have like 10 different titles, really, and it depends who I'm talking to. I just put the different hat on, you know what I mean? And so what does that actually mean? It means I study ancient public health. So you've all probably heard a lot about public health recently, but I do it in the past at archaeological sites, and I specifically do it from an interdisciplinary lens where I use human bone, I use historical documents and material culture, or the stuff that people leave behind. And I've worked all over the world in places like Egypt and the Sudan, and I study things like ancient child and maternal mortality, health disparities, so how disease burden is different between people within a population and between populations, study things like able-bodiedness and what does it mean to be healthy, which I have a feeling we're going to be talking about later. And recently at the site that I work at in Aswan in Egypt, which is in the south, we found one of the oldest cases of cerebral palsy in the skeleton of a pregnant female. And so she obviously died in childbirth, probably as a result of the cerebral palsy. And I do a lot of work locally also. So I'm the director of a little project that's called the Death in St. Lawrence County Project. And we're trying to understand just kind of like the lived experience. So health, disease, life in this county where my university is. So we're studying cemeteries and all the historical documents that's associated with them. And recently I worked at a construction site with 20 of my students because they were putting in a new water tower, not my students, the construction company. Was putting in a new water tower, and they disturbed an old cemetery. And but there were no grave markers because back in the day they put out this creed and it said, everybody come dig up your dead, we're not using this cemetery anymore. So they dug all the bodies up, but kind of left the ones that they didn't know were there, and surprise, construction company found them. So now we're studying those skeletons, mostly they were children's skeletons, to understand a bit about health and life and death in St. Lawrence County in the late 1800s. So those are just a couple little tastes of what a paleoepidemiologist does. But as a university professor, most of the time I'm doing service. I sit on a lot of committees.
No, that's fascinating. And it sounds like you do have your fingers in many, many different pies there. So how did you get into being a paleoepidemiologist, and what kind of skills do you need to do this job?
Okay, so first thing, I'm first generation to go to college. So nobody in my mom's side or my dad's side went to college until I went. So for some reason, my parents owned a small business, and I don't know why, but I'm like, I'm not going to go to college to learn about business. You just do business. Right. I should have went into business, but anyways, I did it. I was like, am I going to do a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology or Neuroscience? And I chose a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology. And it was at Laurentian University, which is in Sudbury, and it's a small department at the time, and you really got to know your faculty members, and it was a 4-field department where you had one of each kind of anthropologist. It was like an archaeologist, a linguistic anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, and a biological anthropologist, and they were all kind of kooky in their own ways, and I became friends with most of them. And for my undergraduate thesis, like my big project, I looked at decomposition rates of dead rats. So my girlfriend and I buried rats. She put hers on the surface, and we would go out and dig them up. And so we were hoping to use these decomposition this data to be able to kind of then solve human decomp crimes in the area. Obviously we never did that, but it was fun. Every time we had to dig them up, it was raining, you know how it is, and we got to wear cool suits. And so after that, I didn't really know what to do after my undergrad. So I applied to a master's program at multiple places across Canada. And I got into a master's at Memorial University, which is where Dr. Mant went. Was it for the postdoc, right?
Yeah.
I can't keep track of all your postdocs, but anyways, it was a postdoc. And so when I was there, I kind of switched gears because at the time everybody wanted to be a forensic anthropologist, and my undergrad was kind of forensic anthropology. And this is when like Kathy Reichs's Bones show came out and all the books, and I'm like, I can't do this. Everybody and their mother wants to do this. So then I switched gears and started studying disease in human bone. And I went to the United Kingdom to Bournemouth University to study 2 skeletal collections there, just looking for visible developmental defects in 2 collections and kind of comparing the numbers that existed and what that meant and yada, yada. And while I was there, I worked for my girlfriend who was doing her master's, and I was hired as an archaeologist. I worked up like in the northwestern peninsula of Newfoundland, and we were digging up, habitation sites. And so that was really cool. And then after that, I applied for, a PhD, and I'm like, I don't know what else to do. So, and I got funding. So at this point I'm like, well, like I got funding, I'm going to go. Right.
Yeah.
And so I went to the University of Alberta in Edmonton, which also is where I met you.
Yep.
And while there, I think I was there for 8 years. And my PhD switched gears again. I was still doing disease, but instead of looking at bone visually, I went to look at bone at a microscopic level. So we would call that like paleohistopathology, looking at the pathology at a histological level in archaeological human bone. And that was really cool. But then my PhD was destroyed. I kind of had to do another one. Long story. I don't want to cry on camera. Yeah. And I graduated eventually. And so, in the end, to do what I wanted to do, to be a university professor, to be a paleoepidemiologist, I knew that I had to get a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Arts. I had to get a master's. I had to get a PhD. And it took me around 13 years. But with that, I had the credentials to do what I wanted to do. And then I applied to jobs, and I got my first job I applied for, really. I got a visiting assistant professor position at St. Lawrence University. And eventually that turned into a tenure track line job. And what that means, it's like a secure position that lasts, in perpetuity. And I recently got tenure, which means my teaching, research, and service passed the bar. So unless I do something really bad, I'm kind of stuck there, And so that's my journey. And all along the way, I worked in between these, I worked at Winners, while I was in my PhD. I worked as for Stats Canada, Census Canada, just doing all this crazy stuff, Department of Physiology at the University of Alberta. I worked at the Graduate Students Association there too. Just everything you need to do to pay the bills. And then in terms of skills, I would just say it's like resilience, and you just have to have the drive, obviously you have to take all the courses that you need to pass said courses. But, I would say for me, it was more about just putting your head to the grind and just getting it done. It's hard, you're kind of your own boss for a very long time, and you don't get many gold stars from folks because you're kind of like you're running your own show. But it was hard. At the same time, looking back, it was the best time of my life. So it was good times, right? I met a lot of crazy people.
Who then ask you years later to be on their interview show. Yeah. No, that. I really appreciate you bringing the personal and the professional aspects of that. And I think it's really important to talk about, there's skills you gather as you go, but resilience and drive and organization and sort of being careful and the soft skills and interpersonal skills and et cetera. It's all part of the sort of the major package when you want to talk about questions of health and disease, because a lot of that requires a lot of trust, and there's a lot of intimacy when you're working with living people or working with dead people, and a lot of respect. And it's a really great privilege, I think, to get to work with human remains. And I wanted to ask you, and you did say we're going to talk about sort of health and disease, but language is really important. And so terms like health and wellness and illness and sickness and disease and pathology, how does some of that language play into your work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I was thinking about this, because obviously you gave me the question in advance. So should I even say that? I was thinking about it, and I realized, when I saw the list of individuals that are going to be interviewing, that every single person is probably going to have a different definition. Mm-hmm. And in anthropology, we call concepts like that cultural constructions, right? Where, everybody within a culture would have a different definition of a concept. So anyways, clearly health is complex, and it's a holistic idea
Hmm.
where it's made up of a combination of things like mental, physical, and social kind of pieces that come together to kind of really make a person feel whether they're well or not. But if you had all those pieces and I had all those pieces, I might be able to feel well, but you might feel unwell, right? So it's clearly there's an individual aspect there. And something that I have to kind of grapple with all the time is, okay, well, if we can barely understand what wellness is today, how does somebody like me who studies skeletons study wellness in the past? And it's not as if I'm excavating at an archaeological site and, all of a sudden I'm like, here's their diary and I can read it and be like,
Yeah.
I am well today, or like a barcode scanner and like, well.
Yeah.
It's really complex. We can't understand wellness today. We can't even define it, So what this means, and what's most interesting for anthropologists is like, okay, well, what traces of wellness can we find on the skeleton?
Right.
And the skeleton's really cool because it's a physical kind of embodiment of a person's lived experience, right? But not everything that happens to a person is going to get put inside their skeleton, right?
Mhm.
So, on the one hand, in your head, if you find a skeleton that's covered in disease or illness, you would say, oh, that person was unwell. Well, what's complicated in my world is that, well, if you find a skeleton that looks like that, that means they had to survive to be able to show these signs, right? So if you find a skeleton that has nothing on it, you're like, oh my goodness, they were healthy, but they're dead, right?
Yes.
So this is the problem, right? So what does it mean when we're trying to interpret skeletons?
Yeah.
So what's really neat about the skeleton, because it's a physical embodiment of a person's, entire life, we know that stressors, whether they're physical, emotional, social, can actually leave imprints in the skeleton. So if someone's under stress, what ends up happening is the body's under stress and the skeleton's one of the last places that it's like, well, you know what, we can just like put all of our kind of, I guess you'd say, structural interest into the organs that we need to sustain life as opposed to the skeleton. So you can actually see, growth disruptions and whatnot. And a lot of diseases like syphilis and nutritional imbalances like scurvy will actually leave pretty telltale signs. But
Yeah.
for the most part, we're just kind of trying to interpret what we're seeing on the skeleton. And what's really cool is if you understand a person individually through their skeleton, so information like their sex, their age, their genetic ancestry, maybe a little bit of social status. If you pick up all those pieces that make up their social persona and then add in it all the information that you found that kind of indicates whether they were well on their skeleton, you can tie this information up and understand populations and understand the health disparities that are actually affecting populations as a whole. So if you notice that all the female skeletons have this experience of disease, but male skeletons don't, what does that mean? So why are those females in that population experiencing that health disparity? And that's where the interpretation comes. So it's pretty cool. And it gives you an idea of resilience in a population, but the interpretation is difficult, obviously.
No, that's super fascinating. And I appreciate you bringing in the idea of the social stresses and emotional stress, that we can have things written in the bones that we might not even be consciously aware are stressing us out right now. So the idea that we are affecting our skeletons, and that might be kind of a longer written record sometimes than even an actual physical written record. I like that. Now, what advice might you have for somebody that's watched this video and is like, paleoepidemiology is it? This is what I want to do. What kind of advice would you have for somebody who might want to get into this field?
Yeah, so obviously you're going to need a Bachelor of Science, you're going to need a master's, and you're going to need a PhD.
Right.
So I think of myself as a university professor first. And in terms of what I teach, it's all about the paleoepidemiology. So I teach courses like the human skeleton, forensic anthropology, for example, plagues in peoples. So when you're going through your undergrad, you would want an undergrad in anthropology. You would want to focus on courses like, for me, the human skeleton, forensics, for example, a paleopathology class, so a course that focuses on disease in the skeleton. You'd want to take statistics courses. I took courses like microbiology and genetics, so I understand, the biology of the skeleton. And I think it's really important to get in the field experiences. So doing a field school, for example, for my field school, I worked in North Bay, Ontario. It wasn't a bioarchaeological or a own field school, but, just getting your hands dirty and kind of seeing it all happen in real time. It's pretty amazing. And probably when you're in your undergrad, you should definitely reach out to faculty members who do such stuff and start early. And then, at that point, you would then have to apply for a master's and PhD. And, it can be quite complex at that point. But then you got to talk, then you can send me an email and ask.
That's good. At what point you just reach out to you? Yeah.
Exactly. Or the person who's teaching your current course, Dr. Maddie Mant.
Yeah, that's fine. They have my email. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Mindy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. This has been really fascinating. And I really, again, as I mentioned earlier, appreciate the personal and professional journey. I think it's so important to talk about the challenges and how long things can take, but also how rewarding they can be when you do bring together all those different skill sets to be able to apply it to questions of health, particularly questions of health in the past. So thank you again.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. And thank you everybody in the audience for tuning in. And we will see you next time on Let's Talk About Health.